One of the many useful things you can use PHP for is to process the input that a user submits from an HTML form. Welcome to part 7 of my Learn PHP tutorial series. If you are new to PHP and have not seen the previous episodes, I definitely recommend watching those, as this video may not make sense without first seeing those. We are going to start by creating two files, one called form.php and one called process.php. For the sake of this tutorial, we will use two separate files with these names. However, there is nothing requiring you to use these same names, and it is also possible to process the form in the same file, which I will not get into in this video. In form.php, we will build a basic HTML form. We will set our action to process.php and our method to post. We're going to create three fields: a text input for name, an email input for email, and a select with some options. We'll be asking each person their favorite color. I won't go into detail about the actual creation of this form, as this series is focused on PHP and not HTML, but feel free to copy this code into your project if you are unsure how to create a form. I also won't spend any time on making things look pretty or using CSS. In order to process this form, we'll need to make sure we assign a name to each input and take note of those names. For the name input, we'll call it name, email, email, and favorite color we'll call color. We'll save that and navigate to that page in our browser just to see that it's working. Now back in our code, we'll switch to process.php. Because the action of the form is set to process.php, process.php is the file which the form will submit all user input to. In the last episode, we discussed how to get user input and how to make it a usable variable in PHP. So, because our form method is set to post, we will use the post superglobal to access the user input. Remember, the post superglobal is an array, and each index is named by the name of the input. So because we have an input called name, email, and color, we can make three variables: name equals post name, email equals post email, and color equals post color. If you aren't sure how arrays work, don't worry, we'll be covering arrays in the next part of this tutorial series. For now, we're just going to echo these variables in the form of a sentence. Back to our browser, we'll enter information into the form and click submit. And here is process.php and the input that we gave it. You can see that each time we submit the form, it shows those values that we input. Now that we've received the user input, this is where we would do something with that data. Whether that's using the user input to dynamically change the content we're displaying, or saving the information in a database, or sending an email to the webmaster with this information, or any other number of things. Because what you need to do with this data may differ greatly from project to project or based on the needs of your application, I will not dive into those specifics in this video, as I'm focusing merely on how to get information from the user into a PHP script so that you can work with it and do something to process it. Whatever you do with the information, the first step should always be validating and sanitizing the user input received. It is very important to always sanitize and validate all user input that you receive, because failure to do so can result in a security risk and can open up the door to allow people to attack your site. I won't get too in-depth on how to do that in this episode. However, here are a few quick possibilities that are available to you which can be done at the very least. Although please be sure to research this farther and make sure that you're using the appropriate validation and sanitization methods before working on anything in a production environment. HTML entities is a built-in PHP function which will make safe certain characters, which could allow for undesired HTML tags to be injected into your site. Remember, PHP is pre-processing all PHP code, generating the HTML based on the output of the PHP script, and then sending that HTML to the browser. This means that if a user were to type a script tag with some malicious JavaScript into an input, and you were to save that somewhere and then redisplay it later, it would be interpreted by the browser as HTML and JavaScript, and it could wreak havoc on any user who is viewing that information. HTML entities converts that string to characters that explicitly tell the browser that these characters should be displayed as the actual characters and not used when it parses the HTML. There's also a built-in PHP function called strip tags, which will completely remove HTML tags from the user input. If you're going to be saving information to a MySQL database, you can also use the MySQLi real escape string function to make this string safer before inserting it into the database. These are only a handful of possible options that can be explored. Again, this episode is not necessarily about sanitizing user input, and there are many different avenues to go, including using the much more prepared statements for database insertion, and many other steps that can be done to validate information. None of the functions that I've just mentioned should ever be relied upon solely without doing your research and looking into other options to make sure you've gone the appropriate route to validate data. You can also do some preemptive client-side validation using JavaScript. I'll put a link to a video explaining client-side validation and form handling in the description of this video, but please remember that client-side validation is only a means of improving the user experience. Since it is still client-side, it does not make the data that your server is receiving any safer, and it still should not be trusted. Server-side validation is always essential. The key here is that you should never trust user input and that you should always take the appropriate steps to validate it. Validating means checking to make sure it is the correct type of data that you expected it to be, as well as sanitizing it, which means removing any malicious code which could cause harm to your script, servers, or other users. For example, part of our validation can simply be to make sure that they have entered information for these required fields. We can do that by checking to make sure that the fields are not blank or empty. Since one of the fields is an email address, we'll want to make sure that it really is formatted as a correct email address. There are multiple ways to do this, such as the PHP filter vars function, or a regular expression, or a mix of those things, or other things. So at this point, we now have our input from the user. We've hopefully done some sort of validation and sanitization. We've processed the information, doing with it whatever your application requires. The last step is to now redirect the user back to the original page or to a new page. If you're processing the information in the same file, then this doesn't require redirecting the user. However, with regard to preventing duplicate submissions in the case that the user refreshes the browser, I find that processing the information in a separate file and then redirecting the user is the simpler way to implement the prevention of duplicate submissions. However, it does become more complicated to gracefully handle errors that require the user to re-enter information. To redirect our users, we will use the PHP header function. We'll type header, and then in quotes we'll put location, form.php. And then our next line we'll use the function die. The header function is telling the browser to redirect to a different location, with form.php being that location. And then die is actually killing our script and preventing it from running any farther. After the other code above is run, the user will be redirected back to our form. As long as everything's happy in this file, the user should not see anything in between. It will look like the same file is just refreshing. Of course, having some sort of way to inform the user that their information has been processed would be ideal. The way I would normally do this is a bit more advanced, but as a simple way for now, in our header we can add $success equals 1. Then back in our form.php, we'll add an if statement. If success is equal to 1, then we'll echo your information has been submitted, and we'll close our if statement. If you are not familiar with if statements, we'll be covering those in part 9 of this tutorial series. Until then, you can simply copy this short bit of code, and I'll help you understand what it means in a couple episodes. And we've created a very simple HTML form with a very basic PHP server-side handling. In future episodes of this tutorial series, we will continue to build upon this form as we look at additional areas and more advanced parts of PHP. If you found this video helpful, please hit the like button. Thanks for watching, and please consider subscribing and sharing.